Hi, everybody. Welcome to another C3UG video. My name is Graham Akers from Brightech Systems in Vancouver. FICO.
Well, Heiko Vogt from Harbour Light Software Development in Halifax. Colin?
Hi, I'm Colin Breckles with Castlebrec. So, Graham, who is our guest and what's today's great topic?
Our guest today is Gordon Hegfield from HCL. Gordon's been, do you go all the way back to Lotus, Gordon?
I started in 1997 at Iris Associates.
Awesome.
Right,
Awesome.
yeah.
And Gordon has got a presentation today with some additions to LotusScript in V11, Domino V11. It's known as the LotusScript JSON Builder. So, Gordon, I'm going to throw it over to you. Take it away.
Okay. So, as mentioned, I've been a core Iris developer since 1997. I spent most of my time in the admin team and basically in core Domino. So I've been on the C++ code, and then I spent a lot of time the backend classes, basically using Java with the backend classes. So believe it or not, LotusScript's a bit new to me, but we needed this JSON API in LotusScript. So I've been working with Jim Cooper, who probably a lot of people know, for the last couple of years, getting this into LotusScript. So we're going to talk about as an overview of the API, because you kind of need to know how things work a little bit internally, so you know how to use it. And then I'm going to talk about the new features and the basic usage patterns. And most of this is going to be done via examples because there's not a lot of interesting things with slides. Okay, so I debated on whether to show you this, but I thought it was necessary because the JSON API is, I think, different from most of the other things in the backend classes, in that it really has this nesting that is recursive in nature, which you don't really have in the other backend classes, at least that I know of, that I've used. And you can see there's a little bit of similarity to the rich text API, in that the anchor object in this case is what we call the Notes JSON Navigator. And we really needed something that's sort of the owning object of all these other things in order for this thing to work. And so this UML diagram, for those of you that may not be familiar, is these arrows basically represent a has-a relationship. So, and these numbers represent sort of what we call a cardinality. So to read this, you can say the Notes JSON Navigator has 0 more Notes JSON elements. Essentially, the navigator's the anchor, and then the Notes JSON element is the object that contains the values you want to work with. And Notes JSON array and Notes JSON object are containers that you use to build your JSON. As I mentioned, the structure of this is very recursive. So you can create Notes JSON objects that contain Notes JSON arrays that contain other Notes JSON objects, so on and so forth. It can get pretty complex pretty quickly. And I like having this picture in my head when I'm working with code. At the very bottom, the Notes JSON element represents the basic JSON type. So there's array, Boolean, empty, number, object, and string. And those of you that work with LotusScript are used to working with variants, so there should be nothing surprising there. The type member of the JSON element class is the member that you will use to figure out what type you may be looking at in certain cases. And then finally, the name attribute is optional, because in certain cases, for instance, when you're using Notes JSON arrays, the name element has no meaning, right? Because Notes JSON arrays basically are a collection of values that have no name, whereas Notes JSON objects are a collection of elements that have a name and a value. So moving on. I wanted to give you an idea here of what really happens whenever you use the API to parse a JSON string and visit nodes, for instance, of the string, of the JSON string. So here, on the left, I got some JSON, very simple JSON. We're going to see more of this later. And on the right here, I have essentially the result of what would happen if you visit every one of these nodes on the left with the API. And so as you can see, the navigator in this case contains a bunch of Notes.json elements, 5 in this case, and 4 of them correspond to the scalar types over here. And then this 5th one corresponds to this array, which basically results in this array object being created. And then it has these 3 elements inside, which are in this case strings. So whenever we parse a JSON string, we don't create these things automatically because we don't want to waste memory. But every time you reference an element, these elements will get created. This is just another mental picture to keep in the back of your mind when you're working with this API.
Can I ask a question on that slide?
Sure. Yep.
My question was, the JSON on the left is like it's one object for the whole JSON block. Would the JSON Navigator be deemed to be the container, as opposed to some JSON APIs use an element for that object and then an element for each child of it?
Yes. So the JSON Navigator is the container of all of that of that JSON until you get it. It also contains a reference to the Notes.json array, right? The thing that's slightly confusing is that the Notes.json Navigator can act as either an object or an array.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I'm going to show you how to make it act like an array later. By default, it acts like an object, but you can make it act like an array, which is one of my examples.
So as opposed to element just being recursive and having other elements as children, the navigator here is representing that JSON object, and the rest of it makes sense.
Yep. All right, moving on. All right, so your basic usage patterns are, for parsing, you get the navigator from the node session, you pass an input stream or a string, and then you access elements either by name, by pointer, that's only at the navigator level, or basically random access using the nth element API. And then new for 11 is the append element, append array, and append object on all the containers. And essentially what happens is you append something, and if you want to modify it further, you grab the reference to it, and then finally at the end of all that, you call stringify on the navigator. So stringify is only at the navigator level. You can't stringify individual objects or elements or things like that. But the useful thing is having stringify, obviously, at the navigator level. So with that, I'm going to dive into some examples here. So this is the very basic example. And basically, it shows you the scalar data types of string, a number, and Boolean. And I'm actually going to pop out over here to Designer, because I like looking at the code in Designer better. And I also like proving that my code runs. So here, essentially, you create the navigator with an empty string, and then you simply call append element on the navigator, and that gives you the result. Now, here's the first gotcha, is that the parameters to append element are value name, not name value. We did that because name is optional when you're working with arrays, for instance. So it's a little weird, but you get used to it. And yeah, you make the mistake once, and then you realize that you got them reversed. So it's not that big a deal. So just to prove that it works, I don't know how well this comes through, so I'm going to move this over to my code editor, and Control A. Let's see. And there you have it. So there's our first JSON with the Nodes JSON Builder. So obviously we want to do some more interesting things. So I'm going to move on to the next example, which is adding an array. So in this case, I've got an array here of skills in this case, and then so the array is a member of the navigator, the root navigator, and then I want to add these 3 strings to it. So here you'll see the basic pattern for adding containers onto the navigator and onto other containers. So I'll go to example 2. So everything I did before is above here, and then new code starts after this comment. So what you basically do is you declare a nodes JSON array, and then you append that array and you give it a name because it's a member of the root navigator, and the navigator in this case is acting like an object. And then with that reference you got back from the navigator API, from append array, you then append elements to the array, and at the end you call stringify again, the navigator stringify here, and that gives you the result that we're looking for. So if I copy this, there you have it. There's the array of skills now added to the what I call the person object. And once again, it's an array of strings, could be an array of anything. So moving on, now we get a little more complex, right? So I want to add an array of objects here. So here you can see I've got an array named job history, and inside that array there's 3 objects with the elements employer, start date, end date, position, and that's it actually. And there's 3 of them. And for those of you doing the math, you can see that this person's age isn't exactly doesn't exactly match the job history, but bear with me. I'll fix that in a minute. So in order to do this, once again, you follow the same basic pattern. Let me move in here and let's see, that's X. Yeah, here we go. So here I created a subroutine because things get a little messy if you don't do that. So here I want to add another array. I'm going to call it job history. And then to that array, I want to basically create an object, 3 objects. So I created a subroutine to create these 3 objects, which looks like this. And once again, follows the same basic pattern where you pass the job history in as a parameter, and then you append an object to the array, right? And get back the reference to it, and then you call append element on the object this time. And here you can see I'm passing value name because we need the name value pairs in the object, and that ends up looking like this at the top level. Once again, you call stringify here to get your result, and if I run it, let's see what I get. And there you have job history. So that's pretty easy way to basically build a bunch of complex JSON. And the same pattern, you just can use it over and over again, for as many levels deep as you need to. It's a pretty predictable pattern. I will say, in terms of these references that you see me passing around, these are the kind of things that I would not hold on to for long periods of time in your application. They're the kind of things you use them and then let them go, kind of like you do with some of the other backend classes, because I don't think keeping these references around is going to make you a happy developer. I'll just say that up front. So our next example is, yes, the top level array. So in this case, as I was saying before, we want the navigator to act like an array and not like an object. So Because you can see at the very top level here, I have whoops, I'll back up. I have a bracket at the top, which makes this JSON the top level element an array. And then inside that array, I have two objects now. I have two different people here, and I want to essentially, put a collection of people inside this array. It's certainly something I've seen, many times. So what does that look like? Here I am. Okay, so it's actually pretty simple, but you wouldn't believe how much we discussed the ways to do this during development. But essentially, all you have to do is create an empty array at the top. So you give the JSON Navigator an empty array, and that sets the top level object type as an array, and then you can treat the Navigator as if it were an array and not an object. So there's a couple other things about this example that probably warrant some explanation as well. So here I had to really make things much more functional because the code was going to get real messy otherwise. So the basic strategy is that the top level thing I want here is a person, and essentially I want to create a person that's a Notes JSON object. So I made a function that returns a reference to the person that I can then do things to afterwards. So the pen person, we've basically seen that now, where you essentially create an object, you append it to the Navigator, and in this case you notice that there's no name here because Navigator is now an array. So a name is nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense. Nothing bad happens if you give it a name, but you can't really make any use of it. And then you append the elements that are passed in as parameters. And then in this case, I return that object because I want to do something with it next. So if I go back out here to my top level function, so the next thing I want to append some skills, and I want to append job history to this person. So if I go into append skill, I created this function. You'll notice here I created this function called append array if missing, which may be an awkwardly named function, but let me explain for a minute in case you haven't used this API yet. What I want to do is I want to, if there was no skills, for instance, I don't want an empty array. I don't like empty things laying around in my JSON that I can trip over later. So if rather than create an empty array, I just want no array. And same for objects. I don't want empty things laying around. So I basically want a code that says if there's none, if it's going to be an empty array, don't create don't create it. But in this case, well, if you look at the API here, basically I want to append this array if it's not there. The first thing that happens though is if I go in here and I ask the object for the array and it's not there, LotusScript's going to raise an error, right? So instead of just returning nothing here, it actually raises an error. So I create this wrapper function that essentially takes this messiness out of the rest of my code so that I can just have nice clean code at the top level and handle the fact that the array element is missing. So I basically have this code that just if the error gets raised and I know it's this magic number 4843, which of course in professional code I would make a constant. I realize this just a little bit hacky looking, but I know this is the number for missing element. Then I come back up here and do the array append as needed and then move on. The other interesting thing about this code though is you can see here, if I come into this code and the array is not missing, then it comes to me in an element, right? And this is what my code usually looks like if I'm looking for objects or arrays inside elements. Is I come over here and I check the type to make sure it's it's an array, and then the value is, remember, it's a variant. So I declare an array up here and grab the basically grab the array reference out of the value variant here, and then in this case I return it back, from the function. But this is what my code generally looks like when I want to deal with elements that are containers. So moving on, the rest of this code is pretty straightforward. Go back up the top level. Append job history looks the same as append skill with just an object, and I do the same thing for the second person down here. And once again, because navigator's an array, I call append with no name, and then at the end I stringify it. And so let's see if my code works. And there you have it. There's a top level array. And then there's two objects inside this array. And that's all it took to make this relatively complex JSON structure. Actually, the last thing I want to talk about is what about modifications? Because you might want to change JSON. You might want to change some of the values for some reason. So in this case, I said, well, let's change a couple of things to show you how this works. So in the first two elements, I said, well, I want to change the first name and last name to something a little more generic, a given name and family name, and then want to make the age a little more accurate given the person's job history. And finally, let's see, was there anything else I want to change? Oh, I wanted to change one of their skills to something else. So let's just go back and see how that's done. Go back to designer. And over here, example 5. So the first thing I wanted to change was I wanted to change the names of the elements, first name and last name, to given name and family name. So the basic pattern is you get the element, and then with V11, these properties are no longer read-only. So I can just set the name property of the element to the name I want it to be, and in this case, both I've gotten the first name and the last name elements, and so I can change the names there. And then in the case of changing a value, I can change the value by, once again, getting an element, and then just changing the value. And that's all you need to do. And then when you stringify it, it comes out with the new values. And yes, it did. So now you see that the new element names are there, and the new skill that I replaced one of the skills with a different value. The one thing you can't change is a data type. You can't change the data type element directly, but you actually can, if you want, change you can actually assign a new value of a different type, and it'll actually take it if you need to do that.
That's very cool.
Well done.
Yeah, I especially like the last little bit of code there, which when I first looked at it, I'm like, holy smokes. And then I'm like, okay, no, wait a minute. That makes a lot of sense. It's given.name. So that name is a property of the given object, and the value. So that actually very clean and very nice. It's fun to see sometimes the things that go in aren't massively complicated, but they add a lot of value. And that's what I see here.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
One thing, I don't know if you explicitly touched on it, but it looks like there's type inference going on. So for example, in the nav.append array on line 24 there, I noticed earlier when you were working with the array, it's automatically creating sorry, I forget the data type, but the notes string element or whatever that your type is for strings.
Yes. So Right. It takes us the LotusScript string,
Mhm.
and it creates under the covers. It creates this JSON string, and the same goes with the booleans and the numbers. We use what we'll do is use the smallest type possible. So whatever LotusScript type comes in, we'll use the smallest type represented in the C++ code that we can use, if that makes sense, right? So we don't use 64-bit integers unless that's the number warrants a 64-bit integer.
Yeah, it makes sense. Makes perfect sense. So all the standard JSON types automatically are inferred.
Yes.
One question, it's not standard JSON, and the elephant in the room is always like other data types that go beyond the JSON standard, which has like strings, numbers, objects, and arrays, booleans, but dates and things, is there any thoughts? Like, would you just store them as a string and parse it? You just have to know your data, or how would you handle things like dates?
No, we don't do anything with it. They're strings. You have to store them however you want. Yep.
Fair.
That's the case with Java too, though, right? Like
yeah. Well, it's the JSON standard, right? So
Yeah.
any parser, unless they did something really proprietary, if you're implementing it as per standard JSON, there's no such thing as a date.
Right. And that's if you look at our Domino DB Node.js API, we use some kind of a string there for dates. I don't remember what it is, but it's something consistent. But it's not we don't make up our own thing.
I like it.
Okay, good.
Not a lot of caveats. The only one you kind of pointed out up front is invert the sort of classic order of name and value. Put the value first and you're good to go. That's not a big deal.
Yeah, I didn't think it was, but
no.
To save it into the database, I would still put it as stringify and then save it to a text field or to a rich text field or whatever how much data I have.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Gordon, and the first thing everybody's going to ask is, when can I use it? And you got a pretty good answer there, don't you?
Yeah, the append functions are new in V11. The original JSON API was in V10.
So one of many reasons to upgrade your servers to 11. Dev servers
absolutely.
first, of course, but lots of goodness, including this.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Colin, I'll throw it to you to wrap. What do we want to remind our users to do, or our viewers to do?
Well, we got all kinds of things to do. Of course, hit the bell icon to get notifications. Throw us a like so we get recommended. You might want to join our Slack channel. You can find that on the c3ug.ca website. And stay tuned for more. Gordon, thanks a million. Well done, my friend.
Thanks, Gordon.